This series is about how filmmakers reported and interpreted some major events of the 20th century on film. In each programme we compare the film evidence of the same event. We'll always ask, when was each film made and what does it really tell us? Who made the film and why? The Russian Revolution of 1917 is one of the key events of 20th century history. This programme in Film Century will look at how the revolution was presented on film from 1917 to 1927. The film extracts we'll show mostly record moments from history unfolding in front of the camera. But very often events would be restaged years later to embellish the record. Sometimes with film it becomes difficult to distinguish between fact and fiction. We see examples of this in the ways in which the Bolshevik leader of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, was depicted. Sometimes the picture of Lenin is of Lenin himself. Sometimes it's a lookalike actor playing his part. Lenin's views on cinema play an important role in Film Century and the Russian Revolution.
Вы должны помнить, что из всех искусств для нас важнейшим является кино.
In the early days of cinema, no one would have been able to superimpose pictures of Lenin over words on the screen and add sound as we have just done. Early film had no soundtrack. Short films, shot in daylight, were all that news cameras could record in 1914. Often live music would have been played when the film was shown. These street scenes are typical of what a photographer standing behind a camera on a tripod would record. These people are about to enlist as soldiers to fight in the Tsar's army. Most walk by self-consciously, but keep watching this small boy who decides to stay in the picture. Here, Tsar Nicholas II and the Tsarina Alexandra greet their subjects from the balcony of the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They acknowledge the cheers of the crowd, demonstrating in favour of the decision to enter the war against Germany in August 1914. But the Tsar is not very easy to see. The camera is a long way away, and far too bulky to carry a telephoto lens. The Winter Palace had become the seat of the provisional government after the Tsar had been deposed in the spring of 1917. And it was the Winter Palace that was seized on Lenin's orders in October 1917. Today we recognize the taking of the Winter Palace by the Bolsheviks as an important historic event, but remarkably enough there is very little film of what actually happened on the night of October the 25th, 1917. As far as we know, these are the only genuine scenes shot during the Russian Revolution which have survived. This is history in the making. But it's not very dramatic, and it's not very clear what's going on. We can identify Bolsheviks and other revolutionaries outside their headquarters, the Smolny Institute. It was from this building that Lenin controlled the revolution. These are provisional government troops outside the Winter Palace, protecting the government of Prime Minister Kerensky. These shots of the palace itself do show some evidence of rifle fire damage to the stonework, but nothing to suggest the fighting had been fierce. In fact, there was almost no resistance in the taking of the Winter Palace. The event is often called the Bloodless Coup. These pictures from Moscow indicate that the fighting there had been far more serious than in St. Petersburg. There's no surviving film of Lenin, the Bolshevik leader, that covers his part in the revolution. But we do have a cinema record of some local heroes of the revolution in St. Petersburg, people who'd played an important part in setting up the Soviets, which took control there in 1917. This is Dybenko, who headed the Central Committee of the Baltic Fleet and led the fighting in St. Petersburg. After the revolution, he was made People's Commissar of the Navy. Although the Winter Palace had been taken over with little resistance, the Bolsheviks didn't find it easy to take over the rest of Russia. By the following year, they were fighting a civil war. Lev Davidovich Trotsky became Commissar for War. He created the Red Army, which fought the Whites in the Civil War. Here he inspects troops at the first May Day parade in Communist Russia. Lenin is also present, but Trotsky is more prominent. He would go on to mastermind the defense of the revolution and the pursuit of the Civil War. These films come from Soviet newsreels made for screening in theatres in the cities, but also on trains and boats travelling around the vast areas of sparsely populated Russia. As most of the Russian peasantry couldn't read, films took the place of newspapers and spread a powerful message. Cameras at the time were heavy and cumbersome. It was difficult and dangerous for cameramen to get anywhere near actual fighting and combat. So there are few scenes of Civil War battles, but there are plenty of films of Red Army maneuvers, training for action. The cry was "Proletarians to horse" for these revolutionaries who were part of the Red Army's cavalry. Much of the Civil War was fought along the railway lines. This film features a local Red Army commander, Kamenev, who was a popular hero of the time. He's surrounded by members of his staff. Because the new Soviet government was organized on a war footing, the supply lines along the railways had greatly improved. An advance guard of comrades sets off in a steam car adapted to run on a railway. The Civil War continued until the early 20s, when all sides were exhausted, and the Soviets introduced a new economic policy, whose reforms were more moderate than those in the early days of revolution.